Good morning once again. We are starting now with the first substantive panel, and the idea is here to discuss what are main challenges of the right to quality education. And we use the three main areas we are covering in this conference, namely shrinking civic space and academic freedom, education for sustainable development, and access to education for vulnerable groups. We will deepen this then in the working groups in the afternoon, to which you are all cordially invited. But first, we have a very high-powered panel to introduce us into these topics. We are all here except Dr. Busek, who was not aware that we'll start a bit earlier and who will join us when he arrives. The first I'm happy to introduce is Manfred Nowak, to my left. He is presently the Secretary General of the Global Campus of Human Rights in Venice, which brings together some 100 universities and some 6 regional master programs, or is it 7? 7 regional master programs from all over the world. A very important project supported also by the European Union and others. He is a professor of human rights at Vienna University, recently retired, the former director of the Boltzmann Institute of Human Rights, and what is important in our context here, he is a co-founder of WUS Austria and was a member of the board of International WUS in the 90s. In particular, he was involved with the drafting of the famous Lima Declaration on Academic Freedom and Autonomy of Institutions of Higher Education. Manfred, you have the floor.
Yeah, dear friends of WUS, it's for me a great pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful to Wolfgang, Kambiz, and all the others who organized this conference on 100 years of World University Service, which actually was twice postponed, so I'm very happy that we can do it here in a hybrid fashion. As Wolfgang said, I'm currently Secretary General of the Global Campus of Human Rights that is based, the headquarters are in Venice, but we have 6 other hubs. We are kind of the biggest university network in the field of postgraduate human rights education. So we are running 7 master programs. It's always a collaborative spirit. Different universities are working together. One is in Latin America, based in Buenos Aires, the other one in Pretoria for the African region, in Bangkok for Asia Pacific, in Beirut for the Arab master and the Arab region, then in the Caucasus, in Yerevan, in Southeast Europe. It's one of the oldest one, based in Sarajevo, where also Kosovo University plays an important role, and finally the oldest, the European Master Program in Human Rights and Democracy, based in Venice. And of course, all the many challenges that we are dealing on this panel, we also had, of course. The one was already the COVID-19 challenge, which was really a huge challenge for us. 6 of the 7 master programs went entirely online. And we had major problems also in distributing the students. Then in second semester universities, they were lost. So it was really very, very difficult. Only we managed that in Venice, the European master programs actually could arrive in person. We took quite some risks, but we were testing them every second day, etc. So they could come to Venice, and they were very grateful that we were enabling that. Of course, it means that we had already much earlier started with MOOCs and other e-learning activities, and that helped us a lot in also providing this knowledge to all our partners in the world. And of course, we had to fundamentally strengthen our IT capacities because everything was hybrid, need to be streamed, etc. So the COVID-19 challenge is a big challenge, but it also helps us now for the future, when we know that in order to contribute to the climate, the solution of the climate crisis, that we shouldn't travel anymore that much, and that we developed that intensively e-learning and online learning in general, of course, will continue also in the future. At the same time, we had major problem with academic freedom in quite a number of countries in our network. So the Bangkok-based master included Myanmar students. And all of a sudden, it was very, very difficult to send students to Myanmar. We had many people who were arrested. We had to work quite hard to try to locate them, to get them out of prison and etc. We had a similar situation in Belarus. The State University of Belarus is part of our Caucasus Master. And now with all the student demonstrations, those who were most actively demonstrating against the dictator Lukashenko were simply ousted from the university and exiled. Many of them went to Lithuania or to Poland. And we recently conducted a workshop where we invited these students from Belarus who could no longer study at the university in order to provide them human rights education, partly online, partly hybrid. Wolfgang Benedek, as the special rapporteur for the OSCE Moscow mechanism, very much involved in Belarus, was one of the teachers who came to us to Venice. And of course, now Afghanistan is the biggest disaster. We were very much involved in trying to get what we call students and scholars at risk out of Afghanistan by means of cooperation with United States, evacuation flights, etc. But what we are now doing is we raised funds with the European Union and hopefully also with other donors in order then to provide them a safe space at one of our 100 universities across the globe who would be willing to take Afghan professors, researchers, teachers, and students to provide them a safe space for at least 1 year. And that costs quite a lot of money because most of them cannot also really pay for their accommodation and other living expenses. So we are organizing a big network also there are so many organizations, for instance, the International Association of Women Judges, who is very much involved in getting female judges out of Afghanistan and also providing some kind of safe space for them, or Scholars at Risk, and also World University Service. So I just had a very good talk to Kambiz, where we really want to cooperate in order to distribute these persons to universities as an emergency measure. In the long term, we have them to see. And we want to do that also in the future for other students and scholars at risk. And I must say the reaction of our network of universities, the rectors of so many universities, not only in Europe, also in Africa, in Central Asia, and in Asia and other regions, were immediately coming up and saying, yes, we are willing and able to take 1, 2, 3, 5 students or scholars and host them at our universities. So the main thing is that we need funds to actually provide them for their living expenses. Now, another areas where I would like to come back is that I was in the late 80s very much involved from Austria, but also later a member of the International Executive Committee to draft the Lima Declaration on academic freedom and autonomy of institutions of higher education. It was not an easy task. There were all kinds of different philosophies about what is university autonomy, what is academic freedom. And we finally arrived at a fairly broad definition of academic freedom, also university autonomy. We were based still on the idea that everybody working and studying at the university should be part of this academic community and have the same rights. So not only professors, but also other researchers and students in particular. And that autonomy was primarily seen as self-government and, of course, independence from states. So participation also of students was an essential element of university autonomy, and also tenure. For professors, we felt if professors only have a 2 or 3 or 5 year contract, that's not a good way of really guaranteeing and ensuring academic independence. So tenure was a major issue, and also the social responsibility of universities for so many different issues, but working in particular different difficult countries. At that time, we had in mind primarily to protect academic freedom and university autonomy against repressive states. And we were then publishing a number of academic freedom reports, and I brought here the first one, but there were 3 further ones. The first one was published in 1990 and edited by Laksiri Fernando from Sri Lanka, who will also participate or is participating in this conference, Teresa Swinhart, myself, and the late Nigel Hartley. And I really wish to also use this to pay tribute to one of the greatest individuals that I have ever seen, and he was our Secretary General. Also in very difficult times in the early 1990s, and he did a tremendous work as Secretary General to keep the organization alive and prospering. And in this academic freedom report, we dealt with countries where academic freedom was really threatened, whether it's Colombia, El Salvador, that was still at the time of the civil war, Peru, South Africa, which was just at the beginning of overcoming the apartheid regime, and of course WUS had a very, very strong role in human rights education and education in general during the times of apartheid in Palestine and Sri Lanka. At that time, we didn't really think, and I looked again through the Lima Declaration, about threats to academic freedom coming from other than states, from non-state actors, and in particular from the corporate level. And if we look what happened between 1988 and today, major changes occurred because of neoliberal reforms in all spheres of life, but in particular also in the field of education. 1989 was the infamous Washington Consensus, which really by the World Bank and the IMF really formally introduced the neoliberal philosophy of economics into all fields of life, but in particular first in Latin America, in the structural adjustment policies Latin America, but also Central and Eastern Europe, based on privatization, regulation, and the minimization of the role of the state. And that had a very, very strong influence on the university landscape in so many countries. And with privatization, not only of schools and primary high schools, but also privatization of universities, which meant also that tuition and fees were often reintroduced when they have been already abolished. Both the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and the Convention on the Rights of the Child clearly say that primary education has to be compulsory and free, but there is an obligation to gradually introduce also free secondary and higher education. And in legal terms, it means whenever a state is then, that had already free university education, is reintroducing student fees, it's a retrogressive measure that in principle, unless there is emergency situations, violating their respective obligations under the right to education. And just to give you a little bit of experience, I have been teaching and doing research and other kind of functions at this particular university and others for quite many decades. And if I see how that changed, it's a gradual change. I mean, we had from the 1970s a very, how to say, Universitätsorganisationsgesetz, so the law on university organization, which was based on the principles of, on the one hand, providing everybody access to education, to university education, by all kinds of positive measures, of course, no tuition and fees, but also support to students from poor backgrounds, but then also creating a fairly far-reaching student participation. We had also in our constitution freedom of science as one of the basic rights. And that created a much more inclusive university landscape since the mid-1970s to the 1980s and later. And this law was changed fundamentally in 2002 by a new university law, which is really a neoliberal law. It is really aiming at, again, privatization, also certain form of deregulation, stopping to much extent the participation of students in all the major internal self-government issues. And as a researcher, a professor, you feel this in everyday life. In the old times, we also had a lot of competition, because that was always said, if you have tenure, you are professor for lifetime, you are not working anymore. It's simply not true. There's a lot of competition within the academic community, but we could concentrate on teaching and research and some kind of administration of the university. But today, I spend much more time in raising funds for all kinds of projects, because if you are assessed and you have a much shorter term contract, it's also to some extent has to do with precarious work contracts, not only for professors, also for other researchers. But when you are assessed, what counts more is how much third funding you actually brought into the university. And that's quite a lot of work. It's a bureaucratization of the way how you have to apply for funds. So the whole project acquisition, and then you have to report about it, you have to audit it, etc. Many of us spend much more time and project acquisition and implementation rather than on their own research work. And the same is also true in terms of teaching. The university, or Austria, is still in the favorite and in the positive situation that for regular studies we are not asking tuition and fees. But for postgraduate education, that is. I was yesterday still standing here in order to provide the degrees for the Vienna Master of Arts in Human Rights to 8 generations of students. And I had to explain why we are leaving the University of Vienna. And one of the reasons was that they try to make profits out of the student contributions, and we felt that is not compatible with human rights values, and that's why we left to the University of Applied Arts. These are just some examples in a country where still the access to university education is very good and there's not a lot of pressure, but the pressure is coming much more through the privatization. Finally, I'm very happy that we have the Minister of Education of Kosovo here. I was last week with the students in Kosovo on a field trip, and we met also Albin Kurti, the newly elected Prime Minister. And the main message that he gave us and our students was, we are now really building up the economy, etc. What we need is security, is institutional security in the field of democracy, the rule of law and human rights. And for that we need highly educated human rights professionals. So I hope that many of our graduates will actually start their work in Kosovo to assist the new government in really reforming the state after 20 years of very difficult developments. Thank you very much for coming also here.
Thank you very much, Manfred. Thank you very much. He has a number of fans here, as you can see. While we are waiting for Robert Quinn from Scholars at Risk to become online, I will ask as the next speaker Liviu Matei, and I may say a few words on him. He's the Provost of Central European University and co-organizer of this conference. We had an excellent cooperation, and I'm thankful for that. He's a professor of higher education policy with enormous experience in educational projects around the world. And his university, as we have heard from Director this morning, has its own experience with upholding academic freedom and autonomy of institutions of higher education. He is also the founder of the Global Observatory on Academic Freedom, and so I'm very pleased to give you the floor.
Thank you. Is there another button?
He will speak from here. Is that possible?
I'm doing
No?
something wrong with the microphone? No.
It's okay.
Well, good morning, everyone, and if that is okay with everybody, I will rather sit here. I am a little intimidated by the imposing pulpit. You know, makes me feel like preaching, which I'm not good at. So, Wolfgang, thank you very much for the invitation. It is an honor for us at Central European University to co-host this conference together with VUS, with the ministry and with several VUS offices. As a matter of fact, I wanted to say that this conference is a very good reminder of all the tremendous work done by VUS over the decades, and this work is unfortunately not well known and acknowledged in many circles, including in the community of higher education researchers, of which I am a member. So it is very good that we can come together today to realize once more everything that Vus has done. But I also wanted to thank you for bringing us today to discuss about contemporary issues and how we think about them and how we address them, exactly as you said in your introductory remarks. So I am coming from Central European University, but I don't want to talk at all, as a matter of fact, about our university. You have heard so much about it. We would love that this discussion stops and we don't have problems anymore. But I do want to say, nevertheless, that our own case is informative for a discussion about challenges to academic freedom, and not only in the bad sense. You know, we have seen how shrinking space for academic freedom acted, but this is also in a way an example of good developments, and here I have in mind in particular the tremendous expression of solidarity towards our university, starting with Austria. You know, we have been welcomed here with open arms, and we are extremely grateful for that. We wouldn't be able to operate without that. What I would like to talk about, rather than my own university, is challenges to academic freedom, and more precisely, I would note, and we all know this, that there are different dimensions of this discussion, and it is important when we discuss challenges to break them down on various dimensions. There is certainly a legal dimension, even a constitutional dimension. There is a human rights dimension. There is a regulatory dimension. There is a political dimension to the discussion about changes to academic freedom, and I would claim, for example, that the current crisis of academic freedom in Europe is to a large extent a political crisis. There is also a human, or perhaps I should say humane dimension of the crisis of academic freedom, and you know, when we think about everything that is happening in many countries, but most dramatically in Afghanistan or in Myanmar, the discussion about academic freedom is not about principles only, about the production of knowledge. It's about people, academics, students, and their families losing their lives even. You know, in Myanmar, the regime is targeting academics and students with snipers, for example. So there are all these dimensions of the discussion about academic freedom. There is also an important intellectual dimension, how academic freedom is understood, how it is conceptualized, and I would also say the crisis in Europe is also an intellectual crisis. As the Minister said in his introduction, for many years we have taken academic freedom for granted. There was very little effort to develop the concept, to rethink the concept, to make it more actual, more adapted to the current realities. So considering all these dimensions, I also wanted to say, and Wolfgang mentioned it already, this year in January we have created at CEU a global observatory on academic freedom with participation of many experts from international organizations and other universities, to focus a little bit on developments regarding specifically the understanding of academic freedom. What is changing in the world regarding the understanding of academic freedom, the concept of academic freedom, and we look at this through practices, legislations, other new developments. So we are not focusing on identifying and discussing violations of academic freedom, infringement of academic freedom, which is also important, but try to focus specifically on changes regarding the understanding. And we are trying through this to address questions such as, is there a new understanding of academic freedom emerging nowadays in certain parts of the world or even globally? Is there a need for a reconceptualization of academic freedom? Perhaps could we talk about a global notion of academic freedom as existing already, as perhaps reflected in some international documents, or if it's not existing, something that should emerge, and is it possible to have a global definition of academic freedom? I know these are already controversial questions before I get to any answers, and I expect that colleagues from the panel and from the audience would disagree, but I am really looking forward to a discussion, so I am trying to take advantage of the right to challenge intellectually as it is expressed in the draft statement that we would adopt at the end of this conference. So what is this observatory observing already? And I will mention 2 or 3 observations on it. It is true that the civic space is shrinking everywhere. We have a lot of evidence for that. But if we are talking about academic freedom in particular, there is also another opposite development, which is, I would not characterize it as positive or negative, but certainly interesting and important. The space for reflection and action on academic freedom is expanding. And let me explain what I mean first with one example. A few weeks ago, I wanted to organize a workshop on the epistemology of academic freedom. I won't get into any details, but I reached out to a famous scholar of Islam, and I asked him to advise me who could be a participant who would talk about academic freedom in Islam. And he got very angry at me immediately. He said, "Why are you wasting my time? There is no academic freedom in the Islamic tradition. Islam and academic freedom are completely opposite. Get lost." Right? So I don't know whether he is right or wrong. You know, I know about research about academic freedom in Islamic countries. So Islamic tradition is one thing, religious Islam, political Islam, but in higher education, I'm sure there is something. But in a way, this is the question that I am asking, and let me add another two examples to understand. So if I tell you that there are no constitutional provisions for the protection of academic freedom in Russia, which is true, would you be surprised or not? Well, you would not be perhaps that surprised because Russia is not reputed to be exactly a democratic country. So, well, yes, perhaps we understand. But on the other side, Russia is a signatory of the Cultural Convention of the Council of Europe, is a member of the European higher education area. So there is an expectation from academics in Russia, from others outside, that there should be something about academic freedom. Now, if I tell you that Hungary had constitutional provisions for the protection of academic freedom, but all but deleted them a few years ago, you would be surprised because Hungary is supposed to be a rule of law, democratic country, member of the European Union, and still they deleted this, they reformulated them in such a way that there is no protection for academic freedom countries. So the point that I want to make here is that academic freedom is most probably a concept that emerged in Europe from the medieval times, modern times. Then, you know, it was exported or imported in the United States, but it is now, it is a global concept. There is an expectation that academic freedom should be considered everywhere, even in extreme situations such as Myanmar or Afghanistan. So in this regard, the space for academic freedom has expanded from being, you know, something rather Western, Nordic, to something that is global. Now, you know, I don't want to, I keep it at the level of observations rather than going into details. A second observation is about very interesting developments, recent development with regard to the conceptualization of academic freedom. As many of you know, the ministers of education, including the Minister of Austria, adopted a statement on academic freedom in, was it October or November in Rome? November last year, which puts forward a European reference, conceptual reference for academic freedom, not national, and not global, European, which is based largely on the assumption or conviction that academic freedom is a precondition for the production and transmission of knowledge as a public good. That's very interesting. So we have something that is not global, not European, national. There is a second development I would like to mention here, and unfortunately I have to go back to CEU case, CEU affair. As I'm sure you all know, the European Court of Justice the European Commission sued the Hungarian government, and the European Court of Justice issued a verdict saying, yes, Hungarian legislation is an infringement of European legislation on academic freedom. But the case and the argument was made in part on considerations having to do with the right of establishment and delivery of commercial services, with reference to GATS, as you all know. This is a major milestone. It creates jurisprudence. It is, I think, a positive decision, but it changes, in a way, the definition, the understanding of academic freedom. I'm not discussing whether it is good or bad. It is not only knowledge as a public good, but higher education, knowledge as a commercial service. That's also very interesting, and this is the type of developments that the observatory that I was mentioning is looking at, discussing not only internally but with others. We hope to issue a report for the last 2 years at the end of the current academic freedom. I will mention one other observation, and I'll make it short because I will run out of time. One of the most fascinating recent developments in higher education globally is the fact that the Sustainable Development Goals are becoming a global policy framework for higher education. They are not meant to be that, but they are becoming a global policy framework for higher education. Again, I will not have the time to discuss what does it mean, what is the evidence for that. And in any case, I will observe that as part of the entire SDG discussion, which is very consequential for higher education, there's a clear link between sustainable development and democracy. Right? Nobody can contest it. Even the concept of open society is there. There is almost no discussion about academic freedom in this regard. So there is no link between sustainable development and academic freedom. There are some attempts, usually coming from scholars. So that also raises questions about the understanding of the academic freedom and the need, perhaps, to work on the understanding of academic freedom. So I will end by saying there are very interesting developments in the world with regard to the understanding of academic freedom, some terrible, some perhaps promising, but I would put this as a matter for discussion that academic freedom as a concept emerged in medieval times. The way we know it, it is very much the result of the 19th and 20th century elaborations, including legal work. But is this concept adapted for our current times, 21st century? And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Liviu, for your thought-provoking presentation, and it's really food for thought for the working group to follow this up. In the meantime, it's my pleasure to announce that Rob Quinn has joined us from New York. Rob, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. He had to get up a bit early to be able to be with us, and I would like to thank him particularly for that. Rob is a human rights expert and executive director of Scholars at Risk, a network which, under his able directorship, has grown to 500 higher education institutions in about 40 countries, defending academic freedom and supporting scholars who had to leave their universities due to repression and persecution. And he's doing much more, but let's hear from himself. Please, Rob.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang, and thank you to all the organizers, all the ministry and institutional officials present, all the members and contributors and alumni of WUS who brought you to this wonderful and important 100-year milestone. I'm very sorry I couldn't be there with you in person, but thank you very much for allowing me to join you remotely. And congratulations to you all. Our efforts at Scholars at Risk are, of course, much younger, 22 years and counting, but they're very much informed by, and in some ways, an outgrowth of WUS's pioneering work. When I arrived at the University of Chicago in 1999, I have to start what would become Scholars at Risk. I have to confess that I knew almost nothing about academic freedom. And so I did what I believe one should do by going into the university library And there I found documents that would be the foundation for almost everything we've done at Scholars at Risk since. These included, of course, the records of the World War II era efforts to assist refugee scholars, the records of the Emergency Committee in Aid of Displaced Foreign Scholars, the Society for Protection of Science and Learning, the University in Exile, the École Libre, and other efforts. But alongside these, I found the four-part WUS book series that Manfred mentioned earlier, which were quite helpfully titled Academic Freedom 1, 2, 3, and 4, as well as the text of the Lima Declaration. And I think to some degree, we shaped our own mission statement at Scholars at Risk around the words and the ideals and the experience that were captured in these WUS antecedents. So we've been trying to honor those as our network has grown, and we're the better for it. And so I thank everyone at WUS for informing and making our work possible and more effective. I was asked to talk on the main challenges in the shrinking space for academic freedom. And although there have been some significant contextual challenges over the last 20 years, I continue to see the main challenges the same way I did as those very early months on the job, when I really saw academic freedom as an issue as an outsider. And I say that because, as was said, I'm a lawyer by training, not an academic, and a human rights lawyer by choice. So that's the lens that I bring. And it seemed to me then, and it seems to me now, that the three main challenges are what I call the definition challenge, the data challenge, and the implementation challenge. And the good news is that while the main challenge is the same, I do think we've made substantial progress over the last 20 years. I think this is particularly true with regard to the definition challenge, by which I mean the regular debates about what academic freedom is, what's its scope, who may claim it, against whom, etc. And since the Lima Declaration, as we know, there have been dozens and possibly hundreds of statements essentially reaffirming the core contours of what we as a global community mean by academic freedom, autonomy, and related values. Included among these are the Rome Statement that Liviu just mentioned, the Bonn Declaration of last year, and the recent restatement of the Magna Carta Universitatum. At Scholars at Risk, we tend to cite most often to the UNESCO recommendation on the status of higher education teaching personnel and the recent restatement of the recommendation on science, both of which reaffirm these core principles. Although both have their challenges in terms of drafting and accessibility of language, we use these because both are grounded in UNESCO and its broad state membership, giving us the best claim to universality and impartiality that we have to build on at the moment. Now, to be clear, I'm not against more statements in support of academic freedom, and I do believe that each new statement plays its part, but I do not think we should spend too much time responding to the claims that academic freedom at its core is undecided or even unclear. Rather, I think we should insist on the broadest interpretation of academic freedom, one that rejects a narrow contextual framing and insists on the right of academic freedom within the campus and laboratory, of course, but also in society and in dialogue with the public. I think we should insist on this and then invest our energies not into seeking a perfect, universally accepted definition, but rather into educating stakeholders. And all stakeholders, including the academic community itself, institutional leaders, ministries, other state actors, and the public about what we understand academic freedom to be and why it matters to them as well as to us, and why it must be protected. I think we need to replace the definitional debates with education, awareness, and coalition building. This approach to the definition challenge, I think, will be made easier as we address the data challenge. In 1999, the WUS series of volumes titled Academic Freedom were among the few easily accessible compilations of cases and examples from different countries, looking at academic freedom both as a rights issue and an international concern, intimately connected with other rights issues, including, not least, the right to education. I think we've made some progress over the last 20 years building data sets and case examples and tools for measuring and understanding the scope of threats and violations to academic freedom. And among these are Education International's Barometer on Human and Trade Union Rights, the European University Association's Autonomy Scorecard, and more recently, Scholars at Risk Monitoring and Free to Think reports, which together have documented more than 2,600 attacks on higher education since 2011 in 122 countries. And the most recent, the Global Academic Freedom Index, a time series measurement of academic freedom based on constituent indicators. The latter, as you might know, is a joint initiative of the VDEM project, the Global Public Policy Institute, and FAU in Germany. I won't discuss it much here, but except to say that 20 years ago, we didn't have a good way to measure changes in academic freedom, positive or negative. And I believe that that impaired effective advocacy for greater implementation and protection. It's hard to make progress if you can't show that you have made progress. The Academic Freedom Index and other efforts have helped fuel promising new efforts now in Europe, in the European higher education area and the European research area, as well as in Latin America, to build more robust systems of monitoring and respect for academic freedom. And I think it's important that the WUS community and all of us work to inform these efforts. We need to properly calibrate these new tools as they evolve to make sure they are focused on the broadest scope of academic freedom. And this gets me then to what I think is really the most critical main challenge, which is the implementation challenge. I think those of us working at the intersection of the academic community and the rights community have a good sense of what we mean by academic freedom, why it matters and why it must be protected. And as I've said, I think we're making progress developing tools that we'll need to more effectively measure it and promote it. What's lacking, I believe, are clear strategies, guidelines, and best practices for implementing academic freedom and related values at the institutional, national, regional, and global levels. At the institutional level, this means developing local policies and practices for ritualizing conversations about academic freedom. It means developing onboarding training for students, for scholars, for administrators and leaders to understand academic freedom and to learn to use it responsibly. And it means engaging local publics so they understand that academic freedom is important not just to scholars, but to everyone. At the national, regional, and global levels, we need to mobilize existing human rights and higher education systems to move beyond general statements of support and to develop monitoring and guidelines and best practices. At the UN level, an important step in this direction was the 2020 report on academic freedom by the then UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, David Kay, which clearly and forcefully summarizes the already existing legal protections for academic freedom in human rights law, which he grounded principally in the existing right to freedom of expression, right to education, and right to the benefits of scientific progress, among others, and noted that there were comparable provisions already existing in many regional human rights instruments, international higher education standards, and national legal standards. Scholars at Risk is working with a coalition of partners to follow up this report to press for greater attention to academic freedom in the UN system, such as, for example, through the Human Rights Council's Universal Periodic Review process, or throughout the work of special mandate holders and working groups. And we welcome partnership with WUS or others in these efforts. Another important step is the new draft Inter-American Principles on Academic Freedom, which were approved in draft form last week by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. We must work now to disseminate these and seek their implementation and to encourage other systems to study and replicate them. Let me conclude by saying I'm aware that in laying out these sort of three structural challenges, I may seem disconnected from the facts on the ground, but let me assure you that I mean just the opposite. Everything we do at Scholars at Risk, all that I have to offer to this conversation on academic freedom, is based on the experience of the several thousand academics, students, and institutions that we have encountered through our work at Scholars at Risk. I'm aware of the challenges in Turkey and Hungary and Belarus and Russia and China and Hong Kong and Brazil and Egypt and the United States and many, many other places. As we meet today, our staff and the staffs of our partner organizations are racing to respond to the crisis in Afghanistan. In the last 6 weeks, Scholars at Risk alone has received over 1,000 requests for assistance from Afghanistan, and that compares with a total of 500 requests all of last year from the entire world. So I'm not suggesting that there are no concrete challenges. On the contrary, there are many, and they are growing. But growing threats in the near term is not necessarily the same thing as losing the long war. I believe we need to respond now, today, urgently to the growing threats, but we also need to be smart, strategic, and persistent and take the long view. The fight for academic freedom is a marathon, as it is for any right. WUS's 100 years of commitment to academic freedom and the right to education show us this. And on the occasion of this celebration, we should rededicate ourselves to this fight and celebrate the opportunity and the privilege to run this marathon together. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, very much for this account and going into the basis of the topic. And the good news is that we'll have Rob again in the working group this afternoon, where he might then develop on this last aspect, the concrete work of scholars at risk a bit more. Thanks a lot and see you later. Now, I would like to introduce the next speaker, who is Elmar Pichl. He is the Director General of Higher Education in the Austrian Federal Ministry on Education, Science and Research. And I'm proud to say that he started his career in 1999 and 2000 when he was the head of the WUS office in Tetovo, who took care of displaced students and academics from the war raging in Kosovo at that time, and he was then our first head of office in Pristina. He is also the chairman of the board of the Austrian Agency for International Mobility and Cooperation in Education, Science and Research, known as ÖAD, which is in charge of the university cooperation, student exchange, and so on, and a close partner of WUS Austria. Elmar, you have the floor.
Yeah. Dear Minister, distinguished guest participants, dear Erhard, Busek, dear Wolfgang, thank you for inviting me to this panel that is dedicated to a crossover discussion on the main challenges. And I don't want to preach, as Liviu didn't neither, but for a policymaker, you know, responsible for the system of university, sometimes it's important to have the position and the perspective which usually only rectors or members of the rectorate have. And in the last one and a half years, there were not so many opportunities to have this. So, as a WUS Austria groupie, as you've heard, or alumni, it is a special pleasure to be with you here today, and I would like to start with some general remarks and findings. And maybe I continue with some aspects we have already heard. Between 2015 and today, we have seen disturbing developments in terms of academic freedom throughout Europe, resulting, of course, in more concrete actions and proposals to protect fundamental values. In this regard, within the Bologna process, the so-called Paris Communiqué paved the way for the already mentioned Rome Communiqué last November, where an Annex 1 has been dedicated to academic freedom. This statement, and I call it Statement on Academic Freedom, points out the important cornerstones of higher education systems and institutions, especially the freedom of teaching and learning without the fear of reprisals. I also want to mention the Bonn Declaration on Scientific Freedom, which has been adopted at the Ministerial Conference on the European Research Area last year. It shows us that the discussions on fundamental values are on the political agenda and get at least the attention we need for an interdisciplinary dialogue in this field. But, and that's a very big but, at the same time while these documents were being elaborated, discussed and finally accepted, we observed critical events in our university and scientific systems in Europe and beyond. Critical events I want to give a simple typology of. We see changes fundamental changes in the basic relationship between political system states on the one hand and their universities, as we've never seen since 45. We see extraordinary behavior, and I use diplomatic words, extraordinary behavior of political systems and states towards single universities. We have a fundamental questioning of political systems and states towards some scientific disciplines we have never seen before. The questioning of scientific disciplines. And finally, of course, we have also strange interpretations of scientists, and now on the level of scientists and scientific disciplines, what political correctness should be. So, discussion bans don't always come from politics. Important to mention as well. It is good that we have resolutions and documents, but we have to take control of real developments. And that's also the field of NGOs like WUS Austria is. And in this sense, there are more and different topics we should talk about. What we should talk about are the mentioned phenomena, but also about the behavior of the scientific community towards other scientific opinions, other scientific views or methods. We should talk about the dissemination and acceptance of good scientific practice, a very important aspect and dimension of quality education. And finally, we should talk about the attitude of some scientists towards the new necessities of digital transformation. Of course, there's a trade-off between the freedom of science and teaching and learning on the one hand, and on the other hand, the necessity to organize a system, a university, in order to provide good education, even in a digital way for students. Universities must actively take up new challenges. It's not longer just about the individual higher education institution. It is about higher education systems, plural. It's about societal systems. It's about innovation systems and so on. And for this target, we need strong universities, public ones, and of course, private ones with public trust as well. The autonomy of the individual higher education institution is embedded in a system governance, embedded in the challenges of the European societies and the European Union, embedded in the responsibility for global sustainable development. We didn't talk about SDGs today yet. In a consequence, it is a responsibility of university leaders and managers to contribute actively and positively in the development of these mentioned systems. Coming more closer to the concept of academic freedom. Academic freedom means free and thus critical thinking, of course, as well as the guarantee of basic legislation to protect the universities. And maybe I have some different perspective, as we've heard from Professor Nowak, as far as the Austrian university law is concerned in nowadays. The geopolitical eye even may focus differently, but liberal universities as the cradle of humanism must be preserved. We know from several reports and studies that the visible and invisible needle points affect the healthy right to academic freedom also in our neighborhood. As with other civil liberties, the situation implies observing, collecting and reporting. Within my ministry, we received messages from other countries, I don't mention the country names, where researchers are being bullied, exposed or hatred or threatened on social media, especially those performing research within areas like COVID-19, the history of Holocaust or migration, to name few disciplines or topics, where their data or interpretations of their research findings are perceived as controversial by some citizens, institutions, politicians, and so on. Those developments are alarming and should sharpen our senses in terms of teaching our young citizens the importance of respect, sympathy, understanding of other opinions, and self-reflection. But I will conclude with a positive message. What we do perceive within the European higher education area and even beyond, as well as within the entire higher education politics, is the following. Whenever fundamental values are at stake in our countries, in Europe or beyond, solidarity with the higher education community is not so far. So we have seen countries establishing students and teachers at risk funds, and we have heard about it right now. For example, schools at risk in Europe, but in other areas of this globe as well. And providing help for students, researchers, teachers who are in fear or in reprisal, or fear of reprisals. So I think a conference like the conference of WUS Austria today is a very important contribution to bring us back to the awareness that the freedom of research, freedom of teaching, freedom of learning are fundamental cornerstones of a free society and for a well-functioning scientific system. Thank you for this conference, and I wish us lively and productive discussions.
Thank you very much, Elmar. It was really great to hear from you as an acting person in the ministry, and also hear about your thoughts, which coincide with some of what we heard before. And it's my great pleasure now to announce as the next speaker Erhard Busek, who in the past had many political functions. One of them was Minister of Education, also Vice-Chancellor of the Republic of Austria, Rector of a university in Salzburg, Special Coordinator of the Stability Pact of the European Union for Southeast Europe, where he also kept education very high. And many know him as the former president of the European Forum Alpbach, where he was responsible to open it to the participation of hundreds of students from all over Europe. I'm glad to say that we also have more than 20 students from different backgrounds in this conference. Presently, he is the chairman of the Institute for the Danube region and Central Europe, and not without importance, he is one of the old friends of WUS, and we have many good memories of a joint struggle for education. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction. I think don't be impressed by the full of jobs I have done. I think even I may confess it is remembering this and looking at in this direction, it is a real burden for me. Why is it a burden? Well, I'm always raising the question to me and also to other friends. I had some responsibilities, but what did we wrong? I think it's necessary to have this feeling. I tried to make a book. I wrote to 25 friends, and I was admiring especially 8 friends who wrote me back, I did nothing wrong. I think that was for me really impressive. If somebody can say this, because I'm really convinced whatever you are doing, there's always also a part where you are doing wrong. That's completely clear. That's the approach which I'm doing to our meeting. Many thanks for the invitation, because I think from my feeling, and it is always said now, we are in a critical situation. First of all, I'm really fed up about this using of critical and crisis, because having learned the old Greek language, I know that crisis is coming from a Greek word, krino, that it means to consider and to distinct. So far, time of crisis is a time of distinction. And here I'm setting my points as a contribution to this meeting. I think we are not doing enough in this direction. I think our world is full, especially the reports, the media, also science and so on and so on. The papers are more and more and more coming up, but I'm always raising the question, it's nice that we have such a lot of think tanks, but I have the impression we have not enough do tanks. I think we should always decide after reading all these works and discussion, what are the consequences? What have we to do with the next step to realize? And may I say, this is a critical point of the current situation in which we are. I think we know a lot of things which are going wrong, but we don't know enough and exactly what we have to do to change it. There are some nice ideas, and maybe it's a nice headline in a newspaper or in a science magazine and so on, but to make the consequences out of it. I will give you some primitive examples, and I'm asking for your forgiveness that I'm doing so. I'm still involved in the Medical University in Vienna. I was for 10 years the head of the University Council there. I'm now in a body which is cooperation between the Medical University and the city of Vienna, which is a main background for this university. What is our problem? It's coming out that the situation in science for medicine and the practice following out of this for the hospitals is changing. We are after a time where we try to know even more in detail about everything. Specialization was immensely strong. And I think nearly every year a new subject was created, and we needed a new chair for this, and we need a new institute for this, and we need money for this, and so on and so on. Now, step by step, it's coming up. It's not really pushed through that we have to look to the human being as a whole. The holistic view of medical science is for sure needed. I think, yes, we decided. What was the first decision? We have to build up a new institute and to build up a new building, and so on and so on. That's it. The real problem is, and we are facing this, and I'm very much concentrating on this, I think our all beloved collaborators, from the professors down to the assistant and even to the nurses and so on, have to relearn in which connections the different parts of medical research, of the treatment is as a whole. Because maybe if you have some difficulties with your stomach, I think it has an impact on the brain, and so on and so on. I don't want to tell you out of which parts the human being is existing. You know it yourself if you have some difficulties with it. But I think the relations and what are the consequences out of it is extremely difficult, I think, to learn and what to do in this direction. I think we will have this institute and we will have a nice building, a high one, and it is necessary. I think I don't want that Section Chef Pichl thinking we don't need it. We need it really, dear Section Chef, but we need the consequences out of it. And in which way, I think the teaching, the treatment, the connections and so on are really connected. I'll give you some primitive examples. We did some research about the feeling of the consumers of the medical universities have concerning how they are treated. May I tell you what was the main concern? The main concern was that the doctor, if he's treated, is looking to the screen of the computer and not to the patient. That's creating a distance. Those who are sitting in some difficulties want that the doctor is looking to him, having some empathy here. But out of different conditions, by computer, in all their love to our computer time, they are looking to the figures, to the curves, and so on, but not too much. What does it really mean? And I think if you are sitting there and have some difficulties, I think you would be happy to get a friendly word and some explanations directed to you. I've chosen these primitive examples, I beg your pardon, but here out of this, can you see in which direction this is going? I'm leaving medicine because it's an endless story. But this is a general problem we have. For sure, we have the climate crisis, but a holistic view of this climate crisis we don't have. We have a lot of figures. We know exactly when we have to close the power stations for coal and so on and so on. But the whole connections, in which way is it connected, and what shall be instead of that, and what is a substitute, and so on and so on, it's not quite clear. I think we have nice years. In 2035, as far as I know, we will have totally renewable energy in Austria. I think I'm going now under the prophets. We will not have renewable energy in 2035. And if you ask with people with a better understanding, they are fully agreeing. But it is not set. So far, on the one side, you have great expectations, but on the other side, you have fake news. I think I'm not arriving in the media at the fake news discussion. Okay, this we have. I think it is a problem also for science. I think my challenge for science is that they are looking really to reality. We had one discussion at the Medical University as the virus came up. I did a meeting with the professors, especially the virologist, who could expect at this time that we will appear every day what they are doing. But may I say, it's a side remark. I never knew that Austria has so many virologists as they are appearing in the medias. If you are looking really to the reports, we have not so many virologists. They are not so bad, yes. But everybody is now a virologist. I think this is a situation which science has also to do some critics. That's a wrong way. I think they are telling nice story, they are getting some money, that they are appearing and so on and so on. It is a problem for science. I think science and the look for truth, one of the most difficult questions for science, I think should be more tougher and more precise and so on and so on. Put medical science aside, we are going in another direction. We are Europeans. The universities are an invention of European thinking. I think it's one of the great contributions. Is the role of the university in our time really done in the best way? Or shouldn't there be, I think, more critiques, more distinctions here really by the universities? I think that's really necessary. I think we have too much hot air also in science, really. If it's a shocking detail, okay, you will get maybe some money. It's totally right, and you get money for research. If you can say shocking, I think I have an idea how we can manage it. But an integrated view of science is not really happening. The word universitas means a general view in the connections of the different disciplines. Ask yourself, is it really happening? Do we have this connected view on the different disciplines of science in the university? Not at all. I think here we have to do some changes. I'm going a step further. I grew up with the real hopes after the Second World War. It will be really great. We will have a new way of politics, looking for peace, and so on and so on. I'm really wondering, and don't be shocked, I think for the moment we have more wars than we ever had. Not a big war like the First and the Second World War, but we have small wars, war everything. We have trade wars, we have wars on facts and figures. We have wars on our computer systems, and so on and so on. Do we have a real approach and common approach, what we are doing with this war? I think I understand the French, that they feel offended that they cannot deliver submarines now to Australia. But that's not the real question. The real question in the background is how we handle the situation with the global power of China. How we can create a cooperation of all those who are eager to have peace really existing. So far, I think that's not the right way of my French friends. And I'm not saying that the Americans are right to do it, what they are doing. We have no real system, I think, to create peace. Peace is one of the great desires that we have. My neighbor is very much working on human rights, which is a precondition for peace. But I think we have to look even to more precondition of peace here existing. The mood for peace, is it really existing? I think here you can see huge fields of science and research which have to be done. I think thanks to this conference, because it is a small contribution, but it is the right direction which we are going, but it is a horrible job. So far, we are always praising what we have invented and so on and so on. Here we should also a little bit critical. What have we not reached? What did we wrong? What have we not achieved? I think that's strictly necessary for being a real responsible human being. Beg your pardon, I'm still optimistic, but we have to do more as we have done already. You are trying to do so, congratulations, but don't wait that the others will do. You have to do it for yourself. Thank you very much for your patience.
So, I would like to thank Dr. Busek for sharing with us his experience and reminding us to look for the real issues in a holistic approach. And finally, it's about peace. That was, I think, a very important statement. Now we'll see what the WUS community is actually doing or responding to this, what Dr. Busek just said. And for that purpose, we start with Kambiz Ghawami from WUS Germany, who is chairing this WUS committee since the 80s and is one of the most experienced experts in international cooperation in higher education. He has special merits in building Vietnamese, German university cooperation, even a special university. He was working with projects in Africa, like Eritrea and Latin America, but he always also put a particular emphasis on the situation of foreign students in Germany and receiving refugee students and improving their situation in the spirit of international solidarity. At the same time, WUS Germany is known for a real bottom-up strategy, working with schools on issues like sustainable development, on issues like global citizenship. And I think that this bottom-up approach in the end is also the most important. Thank you. Please, Kambiz.
Yes, thank you, Wolfgang. It's really hard after such a very impressive speech and statement by the former Vice-Chancellor and Minister, Mr. Busek. And I have prepared for my statement a very short intervention, about 2-3 hours. But to the disappointment of Wolfgang Benedek, I have to change it. Because after this speech of Mr. Busek, it's impossible not to mention how we have been failed at the World University Service. What have been done not rightly, but what we have done wrong. And maybe I invite you to a journey maybe 9.5 decades ago. 9.5 decades ago, this publication has been printed. The publication named Rebuilding Europe. This was the first publication of the World University Service, if you like. And in this publication, you see what the colleagues in those days, after 1920, have been responding to emergency situations. And if you're going through this book, you will see a lot of examples. And even this has been published 9.5 decades ago, it could be a publication from today, because the situation is still the same. We have to respond to emergency situations. And 5 decades ago, the International WUS has been publishing this small brochure about the first 5 decades of WUS activities. And even if you're going through this brochure to this publication, you will see that even more or less 5 decades after the foundation in 1920, the situations has still not changed. The situation, how to respond to emergency situations. And therefore, if you allow me to ask you to remember what happens during the last 4 weeks, or what happens during the last 8-9 months. Before 8 or 9 months, the situation in Myanmar has been explosive. The changes in Myanmar came out of the movement of students and the universities, mainly, and also from the education sector. The response that we have been trying to give was a failure, because we have not been able to assist those people in Myanmar in an effective way. What we have done was solidarity statements, a piece of fundings here and there for those who have been affected by the coup d'etat, but really we have not been able to establish something real. And the Vice-Chancellor and Minister Busek told us, don't build up a next think tank. They are nice, but start with a 2 tank, something to do. And this is, I think, the main message. And this is also part of our failures during the last 10 decades at WUS, that we have not been able to establish a mechanism who can respond on the spot if an emergency situation in different parts of the world emerges. And therefore, this is something which could be also the motivation for all of us to continuing the work of World University Service for the next 100 years. There are a lot of things to do. And if you remember what happens some 4 weeks ago, when the Taliban taken over Kabul. In those days, we have been sending out an information leaflet to the Afghan students in Germany to inform them what the German government is trying to do. And really, after not more than 10 minutes, we received a lot of emails, not coming from the students in Germany, but from their parents and their relatives who are still in Afghanistan. And the first email that we received on those days was an email by a student in Afghanistan, and he started not explaining his situation. He started with an appeal, don't forget us. Don't forget us and please help us. And this student, a female student, are the daughter of an Afghan professor who have been going back to Afghanistan in 2002. And his main mission was to contribute to the establishment of a university. And he has been close with us since his return in 2002, because we run in those days a program of reintegration of graduates from Africa, Asia, Latin America, from German universities. And he was one of those graduates, and he has been working as an assistant at the university in Hamburg in those days. And on his return, we have been able to support him so that he can establish him again in Afghanistan with his family. And now his daughter has been sending us an email, "Don't forget us." And this means that we are not able to respond on the spot. And therefore we decided to bring forward an idea which is only a role model also for other situations in the future that they will come, a role model of an Afghan exile online university. Our idea is that Afghan scientists, scholars all over the world can be forming this exile university, and this exile Afghan university can deliver study programs not only inside Afghanistan until the day that the internet is still working, and the internet facilities in many parts of Afghanistan, amazing, is still working on a very good level. And therefore this is a chance for those Afghans who are still in Afghanistan to get education, getting study programs, but also in the different parts of the world where Afghans living in exile. And therefore this could be a role model which we have not established and not developed during the first 10 decades of WUS activities until now, so that thanks to the technology, we could be maybe in the future able to deliver study programs, even if there are governments who are not very happy with us, what we are doing, because we are providing free education, not only in the sense of free education in money terms, but also with the contents based, and this is what we achieved on a positive side, based on our principles of the Lima Declaration. This Lima Declaration was mentioned by Manfred Nowak and Wolfgang Benedek, who have been in 1988 the main authors of this Lima Declaration, which has afterwards becoming a basis for the UNESCO Declaration on the same topic. So what is also behind WUS is that it's not very well known about his achievements. And this is one of the principles of WUS. It's not important that there is the headline, this is what WUS is doing, but the main purpose is that the work is really done. And this is also the case with the Lima Declaration. Nobody knows the impact of the Lima Declaration for the further discussions after 1988. But if you are going to the contents and the subject, you will see that this Lima Declaration was a starting point for the discussions on the international level about academic freedom. And that's the same case in many other aspects, that WUS has been a forerunner for many topics, but on the institutional level, we have to think what we can contribute for the next 100 years in cases that governments are not in line with our principles. And this will emerge very often in the future. The next case that we have to go to discuss will be that my feelings and my thoughts will be the case of the universities in Hong Kong. If you're looking what happens in Hong Kong during the last 2-3 years, then we will have the case of Hong Kong very soon, that we have to defend the autonomy of the universities, but also to defend the students who are the main forces against the changes that the Chinese government want to have in Hong Kong, and also the academics who are fighting for a free and independent universities, not only for Hong Kong, but also for the mainland of China. If you're looking under which trends and pressure the Chinese universities are working today, it's unbelievable. And therefore, we have to have mechanism how to respond to such situation. Therefore, I'm very thankful to the Vice-Chancellor and Minister Busek that he was made a very clear statement, don't talk too much, start working. In this sense, thanks a lot. And next time I'm promising you to deliver you a short speech about 2-3 hours. But this will be the next time, maybe when we are going to celebrate the 200 years anniversary of WUS International. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Kambiz, also highlighting that WUS has been an incubator for many things, which have then spread out to the educational community more generally. By the way, if you're interested in activities of WUS and WUS Germany in particular, there is a table outside which you might consult during the breaks, where you find a lot of valuable information. Now, I would like to introduce the last speaker, and then I still hope that we'll have a little time to hear about the contributions in the chat and maybe also some questions from here, which we then can also move over to the working groups if we don't have enough time to deal with them here in this forum. But before, we'll hear from Chris Eaton, who is the Executive Director of WUS Canada, which is presently the largest WUS committee. He is having this position since 2009, and he is an expert in international development with a huge field experience in Eastern and Southern Africa, South and Central Asia, and even beyond. Before he joined WUS, he worked for the Aga Khan Foundation, Afghanistan, for several years. So with his experience, I think he has a lot to tell us. Please, Chris.
Wolfgang, thank you. I'm going to pivot just a little bit in terms of my comments. The WUS in Canada, we focus on protracted refugee contexts. And we are the co-chair with the Open Society University Network of the UNHCR's Global Task Force on Complementary Pathways for Education and Resettlement. And my remarks are kind of situated within that context. I would draw back to some comments that Gillian made. Gillian Triggs, she really talked about the magnitude of the challenge of those people who are in asylum or seeking asylum. Talked about the gaps in terms of educational access and attainment and participation of refugees relative to their host country counterparts. And talked about the unfair burden that low-income hosting countries actually bear for taking care of refugees in their own societies in a context where they struggle to provide good education, quality education to many of their own citizens. She also highlighted, and I think we all get this, the tremendous asset that education is for refugees in particular. It's in many respects their most important asset, it's their most mobile asset, and of course, it's the asset that is most difficult to take away from them. But of course, it's not an asset that is always valued or recognized in ways that it should be. So the question is, what should be done in this context? What are the kinds of things that we as a community or as a series of communities can do in the context of this immense global challenge? And I think there's a number of things that I would point to, and I would build on Kambiz's comments related to online education. I think first and foremost, as countries, we have to help those countries that are hosting the large majority of those people who have been forcibly displaced. And we, as heads of our organizations, of our institutions, need to, of course, advocate on behalf of those communities, those countries, for our countries to support them more strongly than they do. We can do that in the context of this global compact for refugees, which many governments have then made additional pledges for supporting refugee communities, also in the education space. But the global compact on refugees is not only for nations, it's for organizations such as ours, it's for post-secondary education institutions and networks. Everyone can actually make a pledge within the context of that compact, and that is something that I would encourage all of us to do. But the question is, what would that pledge be? So I think an interesting piece is, of course, the extension, the growth of online education. And there clearly is great potential there, but in some contexts more than others. So in many of the contexts in which World University Service Canada works, particularly in the eastern areas of Africa, not just East Africa, you know, online access is still very limited. The infrastructure just isn't there, not yet, although it is changing fast. But we have to acknowledge both kind of the potential of that, but also its limitations in many respects. And that's particularly the case for upper secondary and post-secondary education. So there's potential there, but there's something that we have to continue to work on. And there are post-secondary education institutions that actually are extending their online work to, and their courses to northern Kenya, to the refugee camps in which we work often. And that's great to see, but again, limited potential at the moment, great potential, I think, in the next few years. There's, I think, something additional that we can do as post-secondary institutions and those concerned about post-secondary institutions. And this is a strong focus of the Canadian World University Service. And that's the inclusion of people in need of asylum on campuses themselves, not just as scholars, but as students as well. Helping institutions make that a core piece of their mandate as organizations, to make sure that it's deliberate, intentional, structured, and regular, that it is not episodic in response to one crisis or another, because the magnitude of the challenge is consistent over a long period of time. Yes, Afghans are in great need right now, but the communities in asylum in northern Kenya from South Somalia, or from Somalia and South Sudan, have been there for the last 40 years with children born in the camps, and they need a durable solution as well. So the question is, how do you do that? How do you set up kind of efforts around the inclusion of people in need of asylum on campuses? And many campuses have figured this out, although still not at the scale that we need. And what we have found, so we do a lot of work in this regard in the Canadian context. And in the Canadian context, it's a little bit different than in many other parts of the world, because we have a refugee regime that has government-sponsored refugees, but we also have community sponsorship of refugees. And we are, as an organization, one of those organizations that helps to organize the community response. And the community response for us are universities and colleges. And so what we do is we work with faculty, administrations, and students. Students are an essential component of this, around the sponsorship, the reception, the integration of student refugees on campuses, where they get their education as they become Canadian citizens. Now, we've grown that program, we've worked out the model, we've grown that program from 50 to 100, now to 150 students sponsored every year who come to Canada, become Canadian citizens, graduate. It's all really wonderful, but 150 is significant, but still a small drop in the bucket of the immense need that is out there. So in our role as the co-chair of the UN Global Task Force on Complementary Pathways, we're trying to work with other post-secondary institutions, governments at both national and subnational levels, in both the higher income countries and in middle and lower income countries, to create similar pathways that are unique to the context in which they work, because their context is often a little bit different than the Canadian context. But the idea, we've done lots of work with different governments and institutions in Europe. Most recently, we've been doing this with the United States government, the Biden administration, which is about to start a community sponsorship channel in their country as part of the engagement that a number of us have had with the State Department on these issues. And within that, there will be an education pathway. And I think there's great potential here with a lot of the US institutions that are excited about this kind of work. That's the sort of challenge that I think we as institutions here and as organizations and committees of World University Service can step up to and help to make that real, so that every post-secondary education institution makes this a core part of their mandate and has kind of the models, the approaches that help to realize that ambition. So, thank you.
So thank you very much, Chris, also for sharing this experience with us, which might be stimulating for others. Yes, really, indeed. And we can further discuss this in the working groups. Time has passed quickly. Maybe we give 5 minutes more before we break for lunch. And I would first ask Louise whether she has something to tell us from the chat, which she was following.
Well, actually, so far, we have roughly 55 at the moment participants who are following the conference. There have been a number of messages of appreciation. Also, a colleague from WUS Germany has shared the publications about WUS International and the publications that Kambiz referred to. However, so far there haven't been any specific questions to the panelists.
Thank you very much. Appreciation is much appreciated. But before we break, I would like to give this room the possibility, if there are any urgent questions you would like to address and which you might maybe not be able to address in the working group, because these people will now split among the working groups. Is there anybody who would like to put a question or a comment? Or did we exhaust you so properly that all you can think of at this moment is the buffet lunch? I think, yes. Adriano, take a microphone.
Thank you.
Adriano works with the Global Campus and has just helped in building up a human rights center in Eastern Timor.
Thank you very much for the panel. I just want to ask you a question, maybe also a reflection, which is maybe generational, if you want, for Professor Matei especially. So basically, I share with you the double feeling of the political limitations which are now affecting the space to academic freedom. On the other side, we also see positive developments. My generation from the mid-80s was the one that was studying during the golden age of European deepening, for instance, and integration. So the so-called Erasmus generation, and I believe it's a shared feeling with many other similar age colleagues. Many of us took the chance to study abroad in several occasions and so on. That seemed to me back then the pinnacle of this integration of the university system, education area. Yet we went even far beyond that. The new policies of the European Commission for the so-called European academic alliances, they make seem the Erasmus as a prehistorical endeavor, you know, with the joint university clusters where students, in fact, would be enrolled not in one university, but in a European university, sharing curriculum all over the continent. So when you were talking about the political limitation to academic freedom, I see a kind of divorce from reality in the sense that the policies are still very progressive, yet the willingness maybe is becoming weaker and weaker. So how do we reconcile this double reality? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please, Liviu.
I will try to answer briefly, and I think this is a very good observation and a very good question. I think we need to distinguish between developments in higher education in Europe and developments in academic freedom in Europe. So what has happened in Europe, in particular since the start of the Bologna process, is extraordinary. No, it's unprecedented in the history of Europe and in the history of the world. Tremendous positive developments, and you mentioned a few, I can mention others. So we have indeed created a European space for higher education with new standards, new tools, new ideas, you know, mobility and everything that you mentioned. This space is not complete and is not perfect and it doesn't work the same way everywhere, but it is a reality. I think one big, and it reflects a certain political will, you know, that was there at the beginning, it remained for a while. We can question whether it is still there at present. But nothing similar has happened with regard to academic freedom until recently. So we have this beautiful European construction in higher education, which I would say like a, you know, it's like a compound, but it lacks, you know, a good ventilation system. No, which I think academic freedom has to serve. And it is a question whether there is now political wish for that or not. But I think you are right in general, and I think I'm right on the academic freedom part. And just one small comment, I think this question is an illustration of the need to consider contextual development. I don't want to start a debate with Rob now, because we cannot ignore the fact that these particular developments happen in a particular political, economic, cultural context, which is Europe.
Thank you very much. We might be able to deepen that in the working group. Any other imminent questions?
Yes, there has been now one question coming from the chat. So if I may read it out. So will the conference plan for the future, reinventing WUS for 2021 and beyond, and how WUS can serve the university sector? And this comes from, just a second, I can't see that, from Susai Benjamin, former WUS Chennai, India.
I couldn't hear that very clearly. Is the podium able to identify that question?
Can you turn on the microphone again? So there is one question from a former WUS alumni from India, and the question is about the future. So will the conference plan for the future, reinventing WUS for 2021 and beyond, and how can WUS serve the university sector in future? So an outlook, so how does WUS reinvent itself for the next decades to come, so to say?
Okay, I suggest we use the lunch break for answering that question, because it's a very wide one. But maybe Kambiz or Chris, would you like to react to it?
Well, I think the answer is yes, that is our intention.
Kambiz, would you like to say something?
Yes, as Chris was mentioning, this is our intention, and we have to look what kind of services we can give to universities globally. And this means practical support of universities when they are coming under pressure, and to open pathways for those who need our assistance to continuing their work as university members. And as we have been celebrating today our anniversary here in Vienna, it's a good opportunity to remember that this is not only the case because it started everything here 100 years ago in Vienna, but also to remember that in 1956, after the changes and the situation in Hungary, thousands of Hungary people have coming to Vienna, and among us is also Cyril Ritchie, who has been in 1956 setting up the WUS office here in Vienna to serve the Hungarian refugees. And together with Torvald Stoltenberg and Cyril Ritchie as young graduates have been setting up this office, and Torvald Stoltenberg became later, as you know, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Norway, and afterwards also the High Commissioner for Refugees. In all these days and decades, this was also a service to the universities and to those members of the university. Universities is an association of people, students and many other persons working at the universities, and therefore this is a kind of service that we are giving. And to remember these days, what happens in 1956 is also a good reason to appeal to those countries here in Europe, especially the government of Hungary, to open the gates, to open the borders for refugees. We have appealed to the Hungarian Prime Minister, Mr. Orban, 3 years ago, and remind him what Austria has done and also the rest of Europe has done in solidarity with the Hungarian people in 1956. And until today, we are waiting for his answer. Maybe he is thinking about this and answering a long, long letter to us, what he is planning to change. But this is only a dream, a hope.
Yeah,
come not to reality.
Maybe after his retirement. Thank you very much for that response. And Kambiz already gave you a teaser for the panel at 4:30 when we will be looking into some parts of WUS history. But now it's time to tell you how we continue after the lunch buffet. We will start with Working Group A in this room at 2 o'clock sharp, and at 3, at the same time, we'll start with Working Group B in the Erika Weinziel-Saal, which is next to us here, and we'll switch the two working groups at exactly 3 o'clock in order to use the streaming service for the Working Group B as well. And Working Group C will start, Maria, in which room? In the lecture room 30, which is not very far from here as well, and you can get some guidance to get
Yeah,
there.
it's in lecture hall 30, that's right next to Erika Weinziel-Saal. And the Working Group C will stay in that room the whole afternoon, and tomorrow morning they will be live streamed in the main ceremonial hall.
Perfect. So if you have any questions, please address the staff which is around to help you. But now I thank you for your patience and endurance during this morning. It was a very rich one, I think, but obviously also a bit tiring. So what you need now is a lunch break, and this is herewith opened. See you at 2 o'clock.